And I'll tell you a little something about why we're recording today. Happily, we're recording to make a tape for the Archives of American Art. And there's a dealer in Philadelphia named Larry Becker, who has worked closely with Robert Ryman and Meryl Wagner, his wife. And Larry, upon hearing that I was going to give a lecture on Ryman, said, well, listen, I have a file on Ryman that's earmarked to go to Archives of American Art, and why don't you make a recording and we'll put that in with the file. So as part of the story today, I'm going to talk about how Larry Becker was involved in my journey with regard to Robert Ryman. Often in this class, people say, well, what do you really think of something? And, I like that question, but I also like the fact that almost everything we talk about is an open inquiry, not necessarily with subjective opinion placed upon it. In the case of Ryman and monochrome painting in particular, I think many of you have often heard me say, that my favorite kind of painting is monochrome painting. And some people take this as a conceit or a provocation or perhaps even a joke. And oftentimes I kind of brush it off in a cursory way and say, I'll just tell you that, but I'm not going to tell you a lot more than that, Those are just where my personal interests lie and where my scholarship lies. Well, in the case of Robert Ryman, I don't really think he is a monochrome painter. And maybe we can get to that today. Hi. You want to sit in front? Okay. So in the case of Robert Ryman, I don't think of him as a monochrome painter. I think of him as much more than that. What's the next slide, Louise? Maybe we'll look at something. Expository description of experience of seeing show. Isn't that a redundancy?
I would say so.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I don't even know.
This is something where you just have to fill in the blank. Okay, now what's the next slide? Okay, so what we are talking about is an exhibition at the Dia Art Foundation, 545 West 22nd Street. How many of you have had a chance to see this show? Wow, that's terrific. It was so Arctic and freezing. And the last time I was in Chelsea was Saturday, and people were literally screaming as they reached 11th Avenue. And the light posts were going like this. So it's really something. But I have to say, using subjective language, that this is an extraordinarily beautiful show to me in terms of how it is mounted, the work that's included in it, and the experience of the exhibition vis-a-vis the artist and the host institution. Keep going. So, expository description. I wanted to say about this conceit of monochrome painting and how it's received by the general public. With Robert Ryman, I often try to make the point, I say, the whole general public world loves Monet. They love Impressionism. They love the Orangerie, the water lily paintings. And by now, it seems, the whole world also loves Jasper Johns for his iconic treatments of American subject matter, his encaustic brushstrokes, his Americanness, the radicality of his methods weighed against the narrative of subject matter. But projecting into the future, I would like to say that I think the whole popular audience world is finally going to get to the point where they see that Robert Ryman belongs in that very same place. And the same way we say, oh, Monet is so beautiful, and Jasper Johns is so beautiful. I think people are finally going to get there. I'm not just talking about you and me. Everybody is going to say, wow, these Rymans are so beautiful. Because what we experience in this classroom, and generally, is this incredible transformation where it is the art of viewing art. And you learn to see things through their surrounding subject, and you learn to see things through references, but you learn to see things for what they are. And I think that in the case of Ryman, they are as distinctive and idiosyncratic and beautiful in terms of the aesthetics of beauty as any artist who has been elevated previously. When I got to the exhibition space on West 22nd Street, I'll talk a little bit later about Dia Foundation and what it is. I went after class last Thursday, so took a crosstown bus, got over there about 4:30 p.m. Well, I was just about the only person in the exhibition because you have to pay $8 and you might as well be going to Chelsea shows instead nearby. But also because it's sort of a destination-driven thing. But when I got there, they didn't have the lights on. So my camera is very sensitive to low light, so I was able to take these low light pictures, and you'll get a little bit of a sense for it. But really, it was twilight coming into darkness. And this space has this incredible kind of barrel vault, taxi garage, ceiling with skylights. And people say, oh, Ryman, he's that guy who just paints the white paintings, right? Well, yes, but they're not just about the color white. They're about the receivership of light, and they're about an interaction with the viewer that's very, very intense. And because we're so used to everything being lit up in this kind of garish way, to see these works ebbing incrementally into darkness was very poignant, especially now with Ryman at 85, also at the end of a remarkable life trajectory, and thinking about him as a person and a New Yorker, and thinking about these works being made in close geographical proximity to where they're now being exhibited, and learning subsequently that many of the works in the exhibition are from Ryman's own personal family collection. Those works identified as the Greenwich Limited Foundation on the checklist. I did feel especially a poignancy, but I also felt a groundedness and a sense of personal affinity for these works. You know, it's been a great pleasure the first 3 weeks of this class talking about abstract painting and those issues that we talked about in Pollock, and last week with more contemporary shows very much also relate to this Ryman experience. What you see are about 40 years worth of work retrospectively, and they are hung in a pretty much chronological way. And there's a tremendous variety of art objects in terms of what you're looking at. When you first come in, you see traditional paintings on linen, but then you see works that are affixed to the wall in unusual ways. You see works that are on paper, aluminum, alternate support materials. You see paint that's been applied in different ways. Almost every single painting in the exhibition or art object or quasi-sculptural object seems to ask the question, what is a painting? And redefine those things within the parameters or the momentary logic of the singular work before you. They change greatly in scale. They change in attitude. Throughout, there is a strongly idiosyncratic, almost argumentative character of the artist who is asking you questions about each art object as he presents the art object. Let's go forward, shall we? So I'm going to give you some personal history on this as a way to sort of try to say how I came into this almost cult of Ryman appreciation. I've told many of you, I went to a traditional liberal arts college, undergraduate. I didn't go to art school. I was always interested in becoming an artist, becoming a painter. And really the catalyst in my undergraduate experience was art history as opposed to fine art. So I don't think we had discussed Ryman ever in my undergraduate art curriculum, and you would probably encounter him today. But Ryman at that time, late 70s, early 80s, would have been considered pretty much a vanguard contemporary artist. So when I went to the art library, and was reading Art Forum magazine, I would see that this kind of existed as a phenomenon and see it from a distance, but I didn't so much know what it was. It had that kind of look of New York in the 1970s, and these Art Forum advertisements and pictures were largely black and white, and you're looking at a black and white photograph of a white object bolted to a wall, and you're thinking, that is something. Yet when I moved to the East Village and I began to have roommates and I began to go to bars and discuss art every night, and this, I've told many of you, was really the crux of my art education, very quickly I realized that it was cool to like Ryman. And I would say that statement still holds true today and has held true the whole time I've been following him. Next slide. Now, around that same time, other artists that might be related in terms of conversation were Bryce Marden. We've talked about Bryce Marden as a kind of hero figure in relation to his own mythology, biographically in terms of his kind of presence in the art world, but also the kind of romantic inclinations of these oil and wax adjoining monochromatic panels, and also very much center of discussion in 1983-85 was Gerhard Richter, the German painter who was working in myriad styles, which included photorealism, large-scale, multicolor abstract paintings, but also these very sort of conceptually driven gray paintings, sometimes applied with a roller, almost asking the question of what is the personal inflection of an artist, and so forth. Last week we talked about the difference between Gerhard Richter in his receivership and that of Larry Poon's Pores paintings of the 1970s. And the Richter context was really the rigorous context that we were looking to for theoretical purposes. Keep going. I would say to this day that among my kind of wonky core group of abstract or monochrome painting friends, that these three artists, Robert Ryman, Gerhard Richter, and Bryce Marden, remain this kind of pantheon. Anytime one of these artists has an exhibition in New York or nearby, all of the people I know would very much want to see that exhibition. And we're talking about a bunch of people who are very disagreeable and learn not to like things or not go out much after a certain point in their life. Keep going. Now, I had heard this term monochrome painting, I guess, when I was in college, maybe even in high school. But what does it really mean? Here are a few historical examples. Okay, so everyone says, wait a second, didn't Malevich make a white-on-white suprematist painting very early on, 1918? And isn't that painting in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art? And isn't that really all that needed to be said, that somebody in a moment of radicality, questioning what a non-objective art object could be, made something that was essentially revolutionary. And that's the spirit of constructivism, to be revolutionary and to have geometry and color relate to philosophical and political ideas. And what more need be said? Often people would say, oh yeah, monochrome. That's what Yves Klein did, right? Yves Klein blew, he patented the color, he was a kind of performance artist, he was a judo instructor, he's a Frenchman, he married something that at the same time seemed quasi-absurdist and theatrical to something that was a leap into color and materiality. The color blue, especially extremely retinal and atmospheric, the material becoming immaterial. Keep going. This is Jasper Johns, and we've come into receivership of these works. This one, long time at the Yale Art Gallery, now at the Metropolitan Museum. White encaustic, which is a medium that essentially dries as you apply it. So last week we were talking about brush marks and their indexicality vis-a-vis the Jonathan Lasker show. Well, to some extent, Jasper Johns was looking at the heroical brush marks of the abstract expressionist canonical artist, who included de Kooning, of course, and Franz Klein, and turning that gesture into a kind of all-over signifier. The fact that he applied these to targets, numerals, flags, is a return to representational subject matter, and a return very much to a kind of genre subject matter about American experience that many people can relate to. Barnett Newman also made white-on-white paintings. And I think the salient point to make about Newman is that his definition as an abstract expressionist, as previously discussed, is that it weighs the internal against the external. And that while he was not dripping or pouring paint in the openly, explosively expressionistic manner of Jackson Pollock, that he introduced this idea that paint, the field, materiality, geometry could all be highly expressive of an internal state. And it's funny if you say, well, what is it about this white art that appeals to us so much? The way light falls upon an inflected surface and so forth. We've been looking at things that are white and identifying them as classicism for many, many years. Here you see the Elgin marbles, and they are, of course, low relief. A lot of times Ryman's paintings kind of have the look of low relief. One of the funny things about our obsession with the whiteness of Greek art in relationship to the philosophical ideals espoused by that society is, of course, when these sculptures first appeared, they were polychrome and the paint has washed off. Okay, I'm going to talk about my own kind of personal experience, get back to how I encountered Ryman. So I had made my first steps toward becoming an exhibiting artist around the first year I was doing a solo show in New York was 88. So that was at Julian Pretto Gallery, and he was somebody who showed a lot of reduced painting. He was friendly with Ryman and Merrill Wagner and a lot of people in and around that generational scene that came out of the 1970s. That's when I first met Marcia Hafif. That's when I learned that monochrome painting had a kind of different definition. If somebody says, oh, Marcia Hafif is a monochrome painter, that means something a little different than the receivership I had had earlier. 1989. Chelsea, Dia Art Foundation, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit more later, been very involved in the kind of avant-garde Soho art scene of the 1970s. they decided that they were going to open a building on West 22nd Street. Not the building that you saw this Ryman exhibition in, but the big brick building across the street. Many of you know used to be the Dia Foundation, probably still owned by them. Well, they had, in their first year, which was around 87, 88, done a Joseph Beuys, Amy Nobel, Blinky Palermo show. And almost everybody in the New York art world went over to see that show because it was a year-long exhibition. It was a completely different way of presenting art in a kind of anti-institution institution. The building, designed by Richard Gluckman, was very reduced in its terms. It was an industrial building converted to an exhibition space as opposed to a museum being designed as a museum. Had a very different vibe, kind of similar to these European Kunsthalls you encounter. There was an exhibition in 1989 of Robert Ryman, and the description here says, Ryman selected and installed the works in the exhibition, which focuses on 13 new paintings completed in the past year for this project and an equal number of paintings from the 1980s. It says, Ryman also designed the exhibition space on the fourth floor of this building, controlling light from the skylights, south windows, north windows, etc. The paintings will be shown only with natural light during most exhibition hours. So this is the same situation that you encountered this week. And Ryman is still living, and I don't know what a hand he had in the hanging of the show, but he certainly was present. Now, I have said about this show that for a young painter, no exhibition more scared the bejesus out of me. Where I thought, your work has to be this severe, this demanding, this extreme to be truly excellent. Many of the works were so open in their definition of what a painting could be. Curved pieces of plastic with a central spine in the middle, and in that spine, the signature of the artist. Pieces affixed to the wall by tape. Traditional paintings that looked unlike other abstract paintings being shown concurrently. Works, as I said, where each work individually reinvented or identified itself in its own terms. And it was really a demonstration for me about the toughness of Ryman's mandate to himself. And if you think of every exhibition in New York as being something of a competition between a salon of artists, Ryman really put himself out there as an exemplar of the toughest you could be. At least that was the feeling from this particular exhibition. When I talk about the MoMA retrospective to follow, it was a complete inversion of those terms. Keep going. Now, 1992, there was a monochrome painter, living, named Joseph Marioni. And he had taken an interest in what I was doing in my paintings. And when I did my first exhibition in Soho at the Elizabeth Corey Gallery, I didn't know who this guy was. And he said, there's something interesting about what you're doing. He helped make some introductions for me. I didn't meet him until I was traveling in Austria and met him in Vienna. I thought he was an American expatriate artist living overseas, because he was friends with these artists such as Günter Umberg and so forth, and involved in this deep dialogue. Well, Joseph Marioni is somebody who's extremely exacting. His paintings consist of these poured, rolled-on field of transparent acrylic color. The picture on the left is a picture of me taking a portrait of Joseph Marioni at his exhibition at Peter Bloom Gallery in West Chelsea in 2006. But in 1992, Joseph Marioni gave me a simple picture postcard from Germany. And it was of the Rhine Falls at Schaffhausen, which is in Switzerland. So I guess it was a Swiss postcard. You got me, Eleanor. Fact checker. And he said, "You have got to go to Schaffhausen." And I was like, okay. And he goes, there's the most incredible installation of Ryman paintings there, and that is what you need to see. For Joseph Marioni, painting is a moral and ethical imperative activity. And as a surrogate father figure, he was very difficult to please. So nobody's perfect, as we say. And I didn't quite get over to Schaffhausen to see those Ryman paintings, but I had the postcard and I had that missive in my mind. Keep going. Now, 1993. So soon after this, for me, mind-blowing show at DIA that was, throwing down the gauntlet. This is how tough you have to be. The Tate in London and MoMA here in New York said that they were going to have a Ryman retrospective. Well, there is, as you know, no greater honor bestowed upon a New York painter than to be given the MoMA retrospective. And at that time, working as a kind of independent curator at MoMA was Robert Storr. More recently, he has served as the dean of the Yale Graduate Art School. Recently, I guess, stepping down from that post, maybe at the end of this year. But first of all, he trained as a painter. So he kind of has painting as a particular sensibility that he responds to, abstract painting in particular. And he's also a scholar. So very much art history based approach. And this is the catalog that resulted from that exhibition. Now, notice on the cover, you're not looking at an entire painting, you're looking at a detail of a painting. And what is being shown to you are these beautifully inflected brushstrokes, material brushstrokes in which you can see the gesture, personal inflection, the direct connection between the artist and the material's support. But they also relate to what we love about post-impressionism, this idea of the individual. Now, these letters here say R. Ryman. Perhaps you noticed on several of the works on exhibition West 22nd Street, they're signed on the front, which is something of a taboo today. And they have this funny kind of childlike personality, these balloon letters. Here we're celebrating that individual. We're celebrating that child in the same way MoMA is celebrating the child in Picasso with the Picasso sculpture show recently. And we're saying among us, there is this unique humanitarian artist, Robert Ryman. And so that is a very different message than the DIA message. Next slide. Now, in that catalog, as part of the Storr essay, there's quite a lot of biographical material. And in that essay, you learn that Ryman comes from Nashville, Tennessee. And what you see is a picture of him from the time when he was in the Army, a little after World War II generation. And you're told, first of all, the Ryman name in Tennessee, if you've been to Nashville, there's a Ryman auditorium there and so forth, and it might be some kind of distinguished American family. But also this idea of somebody coming from the South. It's the same mythology we attach to Cy Twombly or William Eggleston, where we think of them as these kind of Faulknerian characters who experienced the real America and then came to New York and integrated into the New York art scene. And we're also told that he was a saxophone player and that he didn't really know what he wanted to do with himself. So he came up to New York, and it was very easy and cheap to live in New York apartments in those days. And like a lot of people in his bohemian generation, the 40s and the 50s, what he did to support himself was he got a job as a museum guard. And where did he get that job? At the Museum of Modern Art. So the biographical narrative follows. He's working as a guard, and he sees these artworks, and he somehow internalizes personally that experience, but as a jazz musician. And one day, it's said, he walks past an art supply store, and through the plate glass window, he sees a box of oil paints. And he has a kind of eureka moment. He thinks, I should try that out. And that moment is the moment that he enters into an inquiry about what is oil paint. How could I make an oil painting? Those questions seem central to the paintings he's still making today. The narrative, one of romance and place and biography, was so different than what I'd encountered at Dia, where you knew nothing about the artist, only that some artist had achieved a position so outre that they were making objects that were nearly unrecognizable as art objects to most of the world. 1993, I am invited by a printmaker, Garner Tullis, to make some monotypes at his swanky Tribeca print workshop. And as a young person, I'm like, wow, this is great. He's worked with Diebenkorn and all these kind of people. And Garner says, I've just gotten this hot wax table where you can paint in caustics. And I'm going to get Robert Ryman to come in and make some additions. This is going to be what lures Robert Ryman into my workshop. I'm like, okay, great, I do this project with Garner, and Garner says, you like Robert Ryman, right? People are constantly saying that to me. I don't know why. I'm like, yeah, I like Robert Ryman. He goes, I'll tell you what. Turns out Garner Tullis, big opera patron. I can't stand opera. Don't know anything about it. Barely know anything about anything. Garner says, I'll tell you what. I'm going to invite you and your wife, Candace, to the opera, and we're going to invite Ryman. And we'll go to the opera together. Well, this happened on several occasions. I had to buy a tuxedo. So I went to the antique boutique on Lower Broadway, and I got a tuxedo jacket. And we went up to, this ridiculous Lincoln Center building. And Garner had a private box. I don't know, probably all of you go to these things. But these boxes, when you go to the back side of them, there's a little plate on the door. It says Garner Tullis, right? And you go in, there's 6 little chairs in this space. And Garner says, this is the magistrate of Italian culture, and this is Robert Ryman, and this is Candace Zinsser, and this is John Zinsser, and we all sit down. And then you sit for 3 hours listening to this inscrutable thing, and then you get to go out in this little recess, and then they bang these dinner gongs to go back in. During that recess, there's that hope that you're going to get to talk to Robert Ryman. Well, Robert Ryman was this cipher-like character. I don't know if many of you know him. Maybe ungenerous to describe him this way, but he's a little bit like the Peter Sellers, Chauncey Gardiner character in Being There, where, you think, wow, this guy is obviously like a total genius, and he looks like a German engineer with his special eyeglasses and his special suit and everything, but he says nothing. So he's more likely to talk to my wife than he is to talk to me. So Candy would say, I remember one time she said to him about Lincoln Center, she goes, so how do you like the architecture? and Ryman, anything you asked him, the most you could get out of him was like a kind of like fortune cookie, like cone response, So for me, it was a total wash. And we had to go on several occasions for this ritual. And Garner was like, this is going to be so special, and da-da-da. Years later, I finally ran into Robert Ryman somewhere. I saw him. I said, what about, you must be a big opera fan. It's like a 6-hour ordeal, right? And he goes, no, I was just being polite. So we shared that. Keep going. Now, I don't know if you recall, but there was a big deal thing in 1998. There was this play in New York called Art, and everybody was all excited about it. Everybody who takes this class, also big theater people, and everybody was like, we're going to go see this play, Art. And Fred, you were telling me who's the playwright?
I can't remember her name.
Okay, so thank you. The story is set in Paris. The story revolves around three friends, Serge, Marc, and Ivan, who find their previously solid 15-year friendship on shaky ground when Serge buys an expensive painting. The canvas is white with a few white lines. Okay, so the play, it was kind of the conceit of the white painting as a signifier. You know, what does it mean for us today in culture? And it's this kind of open, empty signifier. And it is sort of about Ryman. Now, I was friends with Marcia Hafif, who's this 1970s era monochrome painter, seen here with her extended grayscale, running from white to gray, as shown at PS1. And she said, you know, I like this play. You know, I thought that it was the antithesis of what we painters thought of Ryman. I mean, I thought that it was the popular mythology. Ryman, like Twomley and Pollock still to some extent, it amazes me that you can walk into a museum, see an art object that is 40, 50 years old, and still have somebody outraged by that art object. Why is that art? Why is that a $10 million painting? You know, to me, that is what the play Art was about. And for me, Robert Ryman is about something very different. Keep going. Now, I had made close friends with a painter named Rudolf de Krenus, who died a few years back of a brain tumor, but we were very close. And he was among the more exacting artists I've ever known. He was Swiss-born, and he made these paintings in gray and blue. They were very much about atmospheric light. They're almost James Turrell-like. They're many, many layers of color, thinned with mineral spirits that make what appears to be a single colored square, but is in fact very complex as far as its retinal qualities. And de Krenus said to me, next slide, please. He said, well, first of all, Rudolf had managed to somehow, this is a miracle in New York, get Robert Ryman to come to his studio, which was in the Garment District, and look at his paintings. And Ryman was very sympathetic to what he was doing, very enthusiastic about it. And so Rudolf said, I'm going to go down to Philadelphia. Here's where the Larry Becker part of the story comes in, where Robert Ryman is doing a set of paintings on the gallery wall. We can't see them in this slide very well. The Philadelphia Prototype, 2002. And he went down and he was able to see the situation as it was developing. And what they did was, and you see this in some, maybe you can see it over here. It's almost a ghost image of a painting. One of the things, sort of methodology meets process affectations of Ryman, is he'll use pieces of tape and he'll tape down a square and then he'll paint around the square and then he'll take the tape off and there's kind of a ghost image of where the negative spaces are. And I think of those as kind of tabs that suggest a certain kind of pressure holding down a planar surface. So for me, it's a stylistic affectation. Next slide, please. So these were then subsequently sold by the Larry Becker Gallery to PAFA, Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts Museum, which is a very traditional, largely realist museum, where they are now on permanent display in this fairly odd V-shaped room that has natural light so that you see these kind of ghost paintings in a raking light situation. Upon hearing de Krenus' description of the Larry Becker Gallery, I thought, you know, that's a place that I would love to show. So many things that de Krenus told me before he died actually came true for me, but they were things that he was kind of prescient enough to intuitively find. Keep going. Now, it wasn't until 2012 that I finally made it to Joseph Marioni's postcard city of Schaffhausen. I had gone to Basel for an exhibition, and I said to the people I was working with, I said, I would like to go to Schaffhausen. Is that possible? And they said, okay, that sounds interesting. We've heard about that, And we arranged to go by rail. And so you have this very classic experience. Well, the Rhine Falls are known because it's the place in the Rhine where there are these waterfalls, but it's not an art city. It's, a traditional European kind of industrial city. And there was this collector named Rossmuller, who also considered himself to be an artist. Next slide, please. And on one of these side streets is this incredible collection, which I believe has recently been closed down, called the Rossmuller Collection. And this is what Joseph Marioni, 20 years previously in 1992, had tried to implore upon me to go see. And I had this incredible experience. We snuck a photograph. You're not supposed to take pictures. Where I was in this one-to-one relationship with what is the largest extant private collection of Ryman paintings. So in that building, they follow this mandate of letting it fall into darkness. And because we didn't get over to Schaffhausen until about 3, 4 in the afternoon, by 6 p.m., not only was I completely alone in these galleries, and there was no museum guard, nothing. Looking at 30 incredible Ryman paintings and having this very direct kind of experiential body gestalt visual experience of things coming in and out of materiality, things being at the same time historical relics and existing in the contemporary moment, at the same time being these valuable art objects and something that looked very much unlike valuable art objects. Darker, 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 until finally you're in this velvety light and these things are just disappearing. And it was this most incredible experience. And then I left and I was like, it's like, a quasi-religious experience where you go to some shrine or something because you've had these kind of philosophical, metaphysical feelings and you've had a much different time integer. And because you've traveled as a kind of pilgrimage, that also attaches a kind of gravitas to it. But at the same time, you think it's all so simple. I mean, it's kind of like an open and shut question in a way. So it was a beautiful experience, but very curious. Now, over the years, I've had a few occasions to visit with the Ryman family. One of the things, they're very much a New York family. Ryman has been twice married, once to Lucy Lepard, and lived with her in Soho in their loft. Their son still lives in that loft with his children. And they have this beautiful building 2 or 3 blocks from here off Fifth Avenue in Chelsea. And you can see it's National Register of Historic Places and New York City landmark. It's the former Margaret Sanger Clinic. They raised Ryman's second marriage to Merrill Wagner, an artist from Washington State. They had 2 more children. So they have 3 sons, all of whom are accomplished artists now in their own right, kind of in my generation. There was an arts organization called ART Press that the mandate was to give art books to public schools and to prisons. And I don't know if you remember, Bill Bartman ran this foundation. And there was a student in this class who asked me after Bill Bartman's death from AIDS whether I would help run this organization. And so I said, I foolishly said I would. And Merrill Wagner was on the board. So she and I were in conversation with each other over 20 years. And then when I started to show with Larry Becker Gallery in Philadelphia, she was one of the gallery artists there. So Merrill and I spent a lot of time together. And I had several occasions to go to her house, most recently in the spring of 2015 for her surprise 80th birthday. I don't know who wants a surprise 80th birthday, but it was a chance to see this very, very special particular situation. Next slide, please. So in that house in the parlor floor, Meryl Wagner has her studio space. And, it's really a vision into like 1970s New York. Nothing is really renovated. I was researching an exhibition that I co-curated with Matthew Delegate about the history of the Julian Pretto Gallery. That's where I first started out, and Meryl was great friends with Julian. And I went around to interview Meryl in her home studio situation, and I think this picture really describes so much about her and a life lived for art and with art, and a love of all things animal and human. I said to Meryl, she goes, well, Julian Pretto gave Bob, that's what we call Robert Ryman, Bob, gave Bob his parrot. And I thought, finally, I'm getting somewhere, learning something about Mr. Ryman. And she goes, and she goes, and that parrot's name is Pliers. That's what I learned about Robert Ryman and Julian Pretto. Finally, in 2011, I drove down with Meryl to Philadelphia, and we met Ryman and his grandsons at Larry Becker. And after all these years, the opera and being involved with Meryl Wagner, I thought, well, I'm finally going to get a chance to talk to Robert Ryman. And thankfully, Larry Becker took this picture. So forever in every catalog I ever have, I'm going to have this picture. That miracle of miracles occurred. I finally, the mountain and Muhammad somehow came together. And so we sit down, and I don't know if you know this, but, my family's in the paint and shellac manufacturing business historically. So he's like, I want to ask you about enamel lac. And I was like, okay. And he goes, I can't find the enamel lac I used to use anymore. So we had a long discussion about paint. And here it looks like we're discussing, Heidegger or Kant, perhaps. But finally, I had the door open this tiny little bit where I could talk to Robert Ryman about something that we both love and intuitively know so well, and that is paint, its material composition, and, more importantly, its general availability. I'm going to run you through the pictures that were in that Robert Storr MoMA catalog. I photographed them out of the catalog. It was getting dark, the same as at the exhibition. You'll see we're looking through the past darkly, as the Rolling Stones put it. Keep going. There's the catalog cover, discussed. Now, you have this marvelous picture. Ryman has these kind of protruding eyes and these very particular eyeglasses. And when you see photographs of him, he's either wearing what appears to be like a suit that some, accountant from Cologne would wear, or he's wearing, in the studio, a jumpsuit, as if he's working at Bell Labs and he's involved in some very outre form of material investigation. Now, the frontispiece of that catalog shows a photograph of the wall of the artist studio. Ryman owns a building, I believe, on Greenwich Street. Is that right? Somewhere near there. Former industrial building. And it was said that every time he made a painting, he had a photograph taken of those paintings. Well, they were black and white in those days, and you get these black and white glossies. And he pinned them all up to the wall so that you would see from painting to painting to painting this kind of lineage, life story of one to the next, to the next, to the next. And they all have these individual personalities. Keep going. Now, one of the big things, I was talking about 83 to 85, when I'm having these kind of wonky discussions about painting. You say, okay, well, Frank Stella, it's about, the stretcher bar. And Marden, it's about the surface. And Ryman, it's about the support. Well, what does that mean? It means that with artists in the 60s and the 70s, we've talked about Donald Judd and his essay, Specific Objects, and there was this tension between whether painting should even continue or whether the sculptural object was an art object for the object's sake, art for art's sake. Now, if the painting were to go forward, it would go forward in part by being an object, and its own scale, the apparatus of its attachment to the wall, would be part of its definition. With Ryman, it was said, that very specific notion becomes so much of the language of each painting, so that they have these L brackets. For example, the work that we saw up at Mnuchin last spring in the show about Carl Andre and his circle comes out from the wall. You have this projected picture plane, but it's also got this ridiculous hardware attached to it, right? And Louise, you remember that picture that Ryder Knox, our former student, took of that painting? One of the really great things about that painting was it had this up arrow at the top of the painting. In the midst of this field of beautiful Monet-like inflected brushstrokes, is this arrow like you would see on the side of a painting crate when you ship a crate. So they are at the same time utilitarian functional objects. Well, that asks the question, what is the function of a painting? Is the function of a painting to be looked at? Is the function of a painting to be painted? Is the function of a painting to be in a relationship with a viewer? Is the function of a painting to be sold? Is the function of a painting to be moved from location to location? All of those come into play with Ryman. Another example. These are tiny little photographs in the catalog that we would study almost with a jeweler's loupe to see if we could discern any details about the working practice of this mysterious character. And you'd see these tables that had, hey, isn't that the same name as his parrot? A lot of pliers. There's the Enamelac paint, so coveted. That's Duco brand. And various work tables. Keep going. Brushes. These kind of Spartan interiors. I love these two stools that suggest some type of dialogue might be going on, perhaps with some Kunsthall director. And then these installation shots where it's like you're looking into a world that couldn't possibly have existed because it was so long ago, in a time known as the 60s and the 70s. And to imagine that these works were part of that gallery scene in New York, 1967, studio again, 1970s, more hazy, murky shots, and the triumph of an exhibition at the Guggenheim. John Weber Gallery, 1972. Note the timber ceiling. Stedelijk Museum. Ryman was always held in the highest regard by European museums and galleries and collectors, as were so many in his generation. And one kind of European-like institution in New York was PS1 as it was founded originally under the aegis of Alana Heiss, where you would have these decayed classroom buildings and site-specific installations. There's Ryman in his jumpsuit. That's the action shot. Installing. Brussels, 1974. And there's a picture that seems to be about the 1970s in several ways, including fashion. I love this picture. The idea that Bruce Nauman and Robert Ryman could be lying on the grass, this kind of hat on the ground. These two American heroes in their receivership in Europe, perhaps for some convocation or exhibition together. Zurich, Switzerland. This is the show at Dia Foundation that scared me so much. Weinberg Gallery, 1983, Los Angeles, keep going. Commercial gallery spaces, Lalonde Gallery, Paris, 1984. Studio installation with that wall of photographs, keep going. 1992, I've never been there, but it looks nice. We're going to talk about the exhibition a little bit now as we get to the second deck of slides. So this building, when I directed you to go to the Dia Foundation on 22nd Street, you may have thought, as I did, oh, they're going to open up the Dia building, the Gluckman building I talked to you about previously. That's not the case. Seeing this building, you may have thought, isn't that the building that Pace Gallery was in until recently? And yes, that's the case, but Pace was renting the building from Dia. Many years ago, Dia held an exhibition of Barnett Newman paintings in this space that I remember. And I think they also own that building that D.C. Moore is in behind as well on 22nd Street. Now, go back for 1 second. One holdover to the old West Chelsea before there were any galleries over there, because it should be noted, when Dia moved to West 22nd Street, it was before any galleries were in West Chelsea. And when galleries did first move to West Chelsea, and that would have been Paul Morris and Matthew Marks, they did so to this block. So this one little block was an enclave of art. And these are Joseph Beuys sculptures that are along that block that are very much a period piece. Keep going. Now, what is this Dia Art Foundation? A lot of you have been now to Dia Beacon and experienced this kind of brand. You see people riding the L train or the G train with their Dia tote bags, and you think, what's that all about? It seems like some kind of mysterious cult that celebrates only minimalist art. You know, we don't like that word. Let's say art of a particular period and group of friends or enemies. That's the building I described earlier, former factory building. Keep going. Now, when I was in college, coming down to New York, people would say, have you seen the Broken Kilometer? Have you seen the Earth Room? These are rooms in Soho that are permanent display, still to this day, funded into perpetuity. Is that what we say? Nobody can get anything funded into perpetuity anymore. And yet there are these outre art pieces that go back to this golden era of sculpture and money, patronage from the de Menil family. Both pieces by Walter Di Maria, a highly misunderstood American artist who died not long ago. Who here has seen the Broken Kilometer ever? I think it's still on West Broadway. I've never seen the Earth Room in all my years in New York, which is a loft full of dirt, watered so that it stays moist. Keep going. So this 22nd Street building, like I was saying, was very exciting when they opened it in New York, and it was a different vision of how you could present art. And people were very excited by the Blinky Palermo show in particular. And then this Dan Graham roof pavilion that you walk inside and you have this kind of distorted view. It gave the idea that art was philosophical. Art had a social purpose. That the museum didn't have to be the museum as we had previously known it. And that the art in museums didn't have to be the art that we had previously known. Now, these days, there are a lot of museums that are following kind of the Dia model. And those artists, Di Maria, Judd, Flavin, are widely celebrated. And David Zwirner seems to be running a one-man Dia Foundation with his gallery. So times have changed. Keep going. When I first started going down to Texas, people said to me, there's money. And then there's Texas money. And they're two different things. In Texas, if it's oil money, it's like a pipeline full of money that just keeps coming out of the pipe. So this Menil family, famous for their art patronage in various different parts of the family were part of the way that Dia came into being. Philippa de Manille was in New York in the 1970s, part of a very kind of glamorous, jet-set, avant-gardist, keep going. And there was a German dealer in New York who had an exhibition space on West Broadway whose name was Heiner Friedrich. And Heiner Friedrich was kind of the liaison to the artists. It's thanks to Heiner Friedrich and his gallery that Dia now has the Andy Warhol Shadows series that you see up at Beacon. Those were originally shown at Heiner Friedrich Gallery. And so they had a kind of utopian vision of art patronage where they would fund large-scale art projects, the likes of which had never been seen before. For example, what we now know as the Chinati Foundation, Judd's presence in Marfa, Texas, started out as a Dia patronage project. So typical of the times, there was a great deal of fighting between the various parties, legal and otherwise, and that is one of these chapters of art history that has yet to be fully explored. Look at the picture on the right, and you get a sense of the sort of social milieu that we're talking about. This is Dia Beacon. It's a former Nabisco box factory in Beacon, New York that's been repurposed as a museum. You see an Emi Nobel exhibition. The scale of this building is incredible. Now, it follows the kind of Judd ideal that you take a building that had an industrial usage and repurpose it as a museum. And I do think it's an incredibly beautiful museum, the way it uses natural light, north light, the way it uses existing architecture. And I think for every time you go to a Frank Gehry museum or a Renzo Piano museum, you should think about museums that are not designed to be museums versus museums that are designed to be museums. Now, part of the impetus to move up to Beacon came when Len Riggio, the CEO of Barnes & Noble, said, this is what Dia should do. A lot of us in New York City thought, why move Dia to Beacon? Why can't we have it here? I've seen buildings in Brooklyn that could have served for the Dia Art Foundation. So to this day, I bear umbrage that Dia was taken away from us. But evidently, this presence now on West 22nd Street is the beginning of Dia doing exhibitions again in Manhattan. So that brings us back to this building. And let's go through the doors, shall we, Louise?
Yes.
About time, huh? That's a lot of backstory.
It was.
When I entered the building, it was already getting dark. And you have this whole kind of Dia protocol. She's like, there's this perfect person behind the desk who somehow embodies the philosophical tenets of the Dia Foundation. And I'm carrying my handbag, and I don't know what to do with it. And she says, oh, you could just put it here. And then I look over there, and there's some coats and handbags over there. And I was like, well, would you rather I put it over there? She goes, no, you could put it here. And then I realized it was like a philosophical conundrum. I said, well, it's not just any handbag, And then I paid the $8, which seems like a kind of symbolic amount of money to pay for an experience like this. It's worth $8 Dia dollars. And I entered this space that was already dark. So for the people who think, this is an affront or a joke, it's like at $8, they can't afford to turn the lights on. But then, because it was this winter light, I had this incredible, next slide, please, experience where suddenly I'm with these paintings and I'm like, it's hitting me, like how major they are and how special they are to me and how much I respond to the way the paint is applied and this particular kind of presentation. And here's where Dia, I'm thinking, if I was at Pace Gallery, if I was at MoMA, it would be nothing like this. It really has to be Dia in order for the experience to be so much what I had experienced at Rossmuller Collection and Schaffhausen. Not just the art, but the ideal of the art. And not just the institution, but the expectation that the institution brings to the viewer. What is the viewer asking of you? What is the institution asking? The institution is asking that the viewer be challenged and that the viewer come along into an open inquiry. I think anybody, even an informed viewer such as myself, is thinking, what is this? How do I see this? What am I looking at? A lot of open-ended questions. Keep going. 2 works from 1962 or thereabouts show this early Ryman, where you see this kind of pleasure in the application of paint, where each brushstroke seems to be a kind of celebration of materiality. They have a kind of antic all-overness. I like very much the way the physical field opens up into a kind of broken background space, and you see these colors, blue, red, you see the unprimed linen. All of these interrelate into something that is at the same time literal and depth of field. It's something that's felicitous and deeply controlled. It is in response, it seems, to abstract expressionism, but it's a sensibility quite different from abstract expressionism. Much more contained, much more hermetic. Keep going. Keep going. There are 2 examples of those. You see small works on paper where paint is quite gesturally applied, again, relating to the legacy of abstract expressionism, automatism, or even comparatively, think somebody like Motherwell. And yet, again, a sensibility very different, where it seems to be about what it isn't, or how something can meet expectation in the most unusual ways, as opposed to a fully formed system. Keep going. Now, certainly the knockout work, or one of them, is this big work like the one that we saw at Mnuchin that is projecting from brackets off the wall. And here you can stand in front of that painting and really have the bodily experience where the painting is breathing and you're breathing, and you're in this one-to-one relationship with an immersive physical field of paint that dissolves into immateriality as you stay with it. Works on paper or other unorthodox supports suggest that paintings need not be on canvas, linen, and stretcher bars in order to be paintings. I was alone except for one other group of visitors. Not surprisingly, next slide. Oh, I guess there was another person there. Those are the Dia guards. And when I say Dia is like a cult, check out these guards. I had the temerity to ask one a question. I said, does Dia not believe in putting the dimensions of art objects on their labels? They said, nobody's ever asked us that question before. And they did not know the answer. These 3, this eminence is none other than Adam Lindemann, the owner and proprietor of the Venus over Manhattan and more recently Venus over Los Angeles Gallery. And he's with a female companion. And there's a woman who seemed to be kind of the New York director of Dia, giving them a VIP tour. So I got to be a little bit of a fly on the wall. I didn't want to impinge on my experience, but Lindemann, you see him cocked back into viewing position here. He said, "It's so zen." I was like, okay. Oh, by the way, the woman from Dia was explaining how money might be given to Dia. Not surprisingly. Later, I rushed home to my Instagram account to see what Lindemann had posted. Beautiful Ryman show at Dia, 22nd Street. So I felt a brush with greatness. Keep going. back to the show. So then you have these, it's almost like a dish rag with a painting on it. You're like, what? And again, you see the entire sort of layering of what a painting is, support, possibly gesso or rabbit skin glue, the application of paint, the breaking of paint. So you have these kind of not only integer-like brushstrokes, but seeing into a perceived space. Now here you've defied the standard picture plane because it's not a taut, suspended surface. So physicality is forefronted. Keep going. Hey, did you all think about our friend Jonathan Lasker when you saw this work? And how much the DNA of Ryman had gone into some of these Lasker glyphs that we'd been describing last week? And you think about how one artist can see something in another artist that provides a whole opportunity of possible expansive language. This is one of these paintings on metal, by the way. Keep going. These are baked enamel. The L-shaped reminded me of my brief time working for Peter Eisenman, the architect, and how much he loved the L. This is another of these very beautiful paintings, beautiful because of the way the paint kind of dissipates at the edges. And you get this sense, again, of methodology and procedure are the sort of mandate of a painting. What is a painting? It's the act of filling in a square with paint. As you move to the outer perimeters of that square, it becomes diffuse and you're seeing atmospheric space and the brushstrokes become individualized and you see the emergence of the support structure behind, and the conversation between the support and the body of paint becomes redefined in this kind of half-tone atmosphere. Here you see these kind of distinctive rivets holding a planar mass affixed to the vertical wall. This is one of the more kind of techie pieces in the show. Looks like something you might see in a McDonnell Douglas airplane factory. It's a piece of metal that's been bolted to the wall, and it has these kind of graphic lines that move around it. Again, thinking of the way Ryman so influenced people, I thought about the artist Alan Uglow looking at this painting and how much Uglow's work, which he called standards, had this look of a kind of industrial object. It could just as well be a countertop as a painting. This is the one I asked my students to describe in a written paper, so we'll look forward to reading those, right, Vitold? 1976. And then you have things where you're like, okay, is that a painting? Is that a sculpture? Is this merely an object that was made as an act of provocation or perhaps to vex materials? What do you call those people who fix things? Louise? Conservators in the future. This is a 21st century dust collector. It suggests that the picture plane need not be vertical and affixed to the wall, but could in fact be a movable site, S-I-T-E, and that these small stanchion-like legs might imply a kind of gravitational presence of the object. And upon closer inspection, you can see that maybe this is a piece of painted canvas or linen or paper, which is lying atop a same-sized support. All of these things reveal themselves to you as you look. Keep going. Other paintings on this north wall resembled physical objects. Keep going. Physical object. These are from 82, 83. It was getting darker and darker, and the darker it got, the more I felt myself becoming grounded. There's a room with a table full of reading material. where I discovered my Ryman catalog. This shows the support. And then they turned on the lights. They said, we're really going to let it get pretty dark in here. But they didn't let it get dark enough for my taste. It wasn't like the Rasmuller collection where I nearly fell down the stairs trying to get out of the building. For me, it was like you were in this drama, and time itself had slowed, where you could see the incremental environmental transformation of these objects. And then suddenly the light came on, and it was like, it's all over.
They're still there, the Holy Trinity.
Keep going. So here's what I'd like to do. I wanted to today allow some time for questions because I think questions are going to help us. So we've got about 25 minutes left for some questions, and we also have some student photographs of examples, and they took better pictures than I did. So just run us through the pictures, Louise, and we can see these as examples that we might use to talk about the works.
We have a question.
There's a question. Yes.
Do you think that his interest is intellectual or sensual? They seem more sensual than intellectual.
Yes. Well, isn't that the central conundrum of so many paintings? We wrestle with this when looking at Jackson Pollock and others, and when you hear painters describe their own practice, it's a little like these baseball players when they say, how did you pitch the no-hitter? And they say, I tried not to think. You have to, as a painter, find yourself in a kind of anti-intellectual zone. That said, to me, visually, the works of the highest intellectual order. This is why that Dia exhibition of Ryman scared me so much, because it said, painting isn't just, let's go in the studio and see what it looks like. Painting is each time specific inquiry, specific material, specific scale, specific response to specific issues at a specific time. And should always be rigorous. What does that mean? It means asking those questions. Part of why I went in this whole backstory of meeting Robert Ryman is that he remains, as a public figure, a cipher, where, again, seen in a photograph, wearing the suit, with the European curator, you think, this is an intellectual. And yet he shies away from that type of discourse. When I was meeting New York abstract painters of the conceptual abstraction generation. Last week we talked about Jonathan Lasker, and I said I've never met such a group of verbal, incredibly articulate, brilliant intellectuals. And the type of intellectuals that they were music, literature, film. Those were their references also. But they just loved to talk about painting. I think with Ryman and his generation is very, very different. In the limited experience I've had talking to Ryman, Carl Andre, some other people whose work I deeply admire, I just think that they think that talking about it spoils it in a way. Yes?
You said that the artist sometimes just shuts down and doesn't think, just like this program. Can you just go to the other point and say, like, you're watching the art, looking at the art, but not supposed to focus on it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think there's two things at work. One is, I say that it took me so long to kind of come around to Matisse paintings. And one of the things that finally brought me around to liking Matisse was to see the kind of rudimentary work in the paintings where, you read about Matisse and he's reworked and reworked these paintings. And yet in an area where he's just filling in color, it looks like he just went up and filled in the color. Well, how do you get that sensibility in a painting? And then how does a viewer begin to see that as beautiful? that you see that methodological, procedural application of color has this incredible beauty. Now, your question, again, is about, does the viewer enter a kind of anti-intellectual zone like the baseball pitcher who gets into that tunnel, right? I think this exhibition is trying to do that by taking attention away from labels. You know, when I was trying to juxtapose the Dia Foundation show, the first Dia show, with the MoMA show, you know, we say, like, for example, at the Pollock show at MoMA right now, the first thing you encounter is this photo mural of Pollock and Lee Krasner, and they're in the Spring studio. And that's the whole biographical narrative and the romance that gives you the sort of nurturing support to appreciate what are otherwise extremely tough paintings. Well, if you just go with the tough, then you say, okay, you're being asked to look at this very, very demanding art object. Can you let the apparatus fall away? There's no acoustic guide. There's no docent. They're really asking you to ask yourself that question. And I think that every, you know, whether you're looking at a Bruegel painting or a Ryman painting, you can say that Ryman has taught you to look at the Bruegel the way you would look at a Ryman. You know, ask it how it was made, how it relates to the wall, what size it is, how the paint was applied. And certainly from post-impressionism forward, where you have individual attention to brushstroke or exposed canvas or underwork versus overworked, or the type of qualities I was talking about in Matisse, you're asking yourself to disavow from previous belief structures, which is very difficult. In other words, the provocation is to say, what happens when you don't believe what you already believe? And how do you rewire your brain to believe a new type of beauty? But that's why I think that people learn to love Monet and learn to love Jasper Johns, and they're going to love to learn Robert Ryman. Questions? Yes, Joe.
Did you notice once they turned the lights on, that the perception different and how
Very, very different. Yeah. I mean, the photograph didn't really capture it, but they have these suspended single light bulbs that are quite beautiful. The building is very beautiful. A number of the students who went took pictures of the roof, the skylights. Like I said, the weather was so extreme that it's almost like entering, you know, Ice Station Zebra or something. It had a very kind of outre, only in New York type quality, you know, just getting over there this week. But then when the lights come in, everything's shiny, warm as opposed to cool. One of the things about seeing the show in February was the light was so cool and blue and icy. I think of those Ryman paintings as really quite creamy and warm. And yet seeing them in this environment, everything was into this kind of end of the world, blue-white light, you know, of wandering out to the edge of the glacier, you know, which was something I hadn't expected. It's like, you know, Caspar David Friedrich or something. And then but the other thing is when the lights come on, it's like the homogeneous art experience. It's Pace Gallery, MoMA. The lighting is so terrible in so many galleries, you barely notice it. I mean, look at Loretta Howard Gallery or D.C. Moore. I mean, these galleries have terrible lighting. And I'm so used to, like, for example, in my own studio practice, you're so used to having these lights, you know, halogen lights and fluorescent lights and thinking, you know, light. But actually, if you try to work in natural light and turn off the lights and think that most painters prior to the 20th century, there was no such thing as electric light. I mean, think about that for a minute. You know, it's a very different vibe, and I think it slows down time. Part of the assignment that we gave our for credit seminar students was to write a visual description, you know, based on standing in front of the thing, using only objective terminology. descriptive, active, verb-based, present tense terminology. And that's sort of what ended when the lights came on. Yes.
When it was increasing dusk, did the paintings glow at all, or did they just fade into the? They're not showing off.
Well, they don't glow in a kind of warm light, sensory way, as I thought they might, but they became more brilliant in their illumination, so that, there's a whole question of why. We didn't get into this whole thing today, but certainly it's always been attached to Ryman. Why white paint? And is white a color? And if so, what does it signify? So you've got all these things like Melville's famous chapter of Moby Dick, The Whiteness of the Whale, where you describe the sensory experience of whiteness in these various ways. You have cultural paradigms, and we've talked about last week, the receivership of this, where you can have, now Glenn Ligon making black paintings that maybe mean something as far as identity and so forth. With Ryman, it's like, it's about color, but it's not about color. It's also about bringing your eye away from the issue of color toward the issue of light and value and physicality and the receivership of light, and how much looking at any art object is about the experience of the receivership of light. So it's not so much for me about color as it's about light, and it's about the object, and it's also, as you can define something in a positive way through negative terms, you say it's about not color, as opposed to it's about the color white. Bernard?
Two things. Can you just say a little more about when you say it's about the object?
Yes.
And number two, is there anything in Robert Ryman's writings or interviews
Okay, number one, the object. Again, I think kind of the nexus moment to look at is like 1962 to 1966. So it's really before the period that we usually identify with high, quote unquote, minimalism or deism, which is kind of the 70s. And it's Donald Judd and this kind of questioning of this specific object. And the idea that anything presented on linen, canvas, staples in the side, stretcher bar, is inherently about the creation of illusionism, right? So part of that is because you've seen thousands of paintings before on stretcher bars with staples down the sides, and those are a magic window into a representational world. Now, if you have a Robert Ryman painting with staples down the side and linen, is it carrying over those illusionistic tendencies? I say yes, because I love the picture plane and illusionism. And when I see the edge of that, where it goes from the built-up paint to the paint that's running out of paint, that is illusionistic to me, because I'm seeing space and I'm seeing the tautness of the surface. I'm seeing atmosphere. But when he projects that on brackets out from the wall, he's saying to you, the viewer, he's saying, wait a second, it is an object. And it is a plane. And when he's making all these things out of formica and metal, he's saying, why is this not a painting? In other words, a lot of us, when we go in and see those first two paintings from 1962, 1, 2, and they have all of that impressionistic brushstroke and these little glimmers of color, we can go, ooh, that's a painting. But when you get to a piece of metal that's bolted to the wall, and then you say, the author of these things is telling me these are both the same thing. They're both a painting. So it went a long way to redefine painting in its receivership, I guess, is the important point to make. Not just in the modality of how it's put out into the world, but in its receivership. so that now we can see myriad support structures as paintings. What was your second half of your question?
The second half was just in interviews.
Oh, interviews and statements.
Yeah.
He's very good. He's very concise. There's a collection, and I love the title of the book. It's called Used Paint. That's a triple entendre. He said that it's from trying to get something through customs, where they said, "What is it?" And he said, "It's used paint," as opposed to new paint. But also it's the story of his life. He used paint. And really, he's drawing attention to that very specific act, verb-like act, that you are getting this common material to do something that so changes the meaning of what it is. If you have a can of enamelac, and you go to Pace Gallery, 57th Street, and you see an enamelac square on the wall, it's quite different than painting the base of your toilet. Where is it? Those are open questions. Marion, yes?
Well, would you say that Donald Judd and Robert Ryman and Carl Andre are in conversation with each other as they make these works?
I don't believe so. I think that they're very aware of each other. That generationally, if we want to look at biography and context, they're informed by the same things. Judd, importantly, began as a painter and then rejected painting as a medium. Andre, that was never the case. I would say that Judd is the polemicist. And I would say that Andre is like the philosopher king, and that Ryman is the painter, pure and simple. I think that the Andre has radicality as an object in the world, and I think that Judd, as a teacher, forced people to rethink the issues. But his objects don't have the radicality of the Carl Andre. So I think, it's an interesting question, and the Mnuchin show certainly tried to address it. But perhaps for me, because I'm so hung up on medium-specific definitions, I thought that the painters in the Andre show stood out differently from the sculptors. I still see the Andre work as sculpture and the Judd work as sculpture. Questions? Yes.
Don't you think people really search for color in the painting, though?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think...
I'm not sure they're really white.
Okay, absolutely. And I've kind of thought that about them too. They're all different colors. You can talk about an artist having a particular palette, but there's a lot of the colors of whatever the paint is on, whether it's on PDF or wood or linen or canvas. Plus, anybody who's ever mixed up oil paint knows it always dries different colors. If you're using these enamel paints, they have, you have matte versus gloss, very different type of things. And as you saw, there is color in a lot of the work too. And in Ryman's late work, which wasn't featured in the show, but has been featured in a number of really late career, brilliant shows at Pace Gallery the last 8 years or so, there's quite a lot of color in the work. They're really duochrome paintings with a support color. So absolutely. But I think your question also raises something. Isn't the viewer looking for color? And so, yes, you are bringing that inquiry, the looking for something, into the definition of the art object. And the nuanced answer to your question is so different than that other artists are giving you. you know? So, like a lot of good artists, what Ryman is doing is making something so specific that it transforms the way you see other things, not just objects where you say, you know, that's Ryman-like, but the practices of other artists too are defined through sort of the Ryman dictum.